Montana Territory. April 1879, the wind off the Bitterroot Mountains carried a bite that cut through wool and skin alike. But it was not the cold that made her hands shake. Brielle Vaughn tightened her shawl around her shoulders as she stepped off the worn stagecoach in the muddy main street of White Hollow. Her boots hit the ground unevenly, the weight on her hip shifting. She adjusted the sling carrying her baby, pressing a kiss to the crown of her daughter's head. Etta stirred with a small whimper, no more than 3 months old and already used to the long, jostling rides and whispered promises of safety. Brielle held her tighter. She was 23, alone, and tired in a way that deep sleep could not fix. The townspeople barely glanced at her, some out of politeness, others with that same look she had come to recognize since her husband died in a barn fire last fall: pity, judgment, dismissal. "She's got a baby," one woman said under her breath as she passed. "No man's going to take that on." Brielle kept her chin high. She had not come here for a man. She came for a job, a dry roof, a chance to start over, but White Hollow was smaller than it looked on the map. The boarding house had no room, the mercantile no position. And the schoolteacher post she had written ahead for had been filled last week by a man with better handwriting. By sundown, she sat on the edge of the livery stable, her baby asleep in her arms, her fingers raw from holding tight to hope too long. "Madam," a deep voice said behind her. She turned quick, heart lurching. The man standing there was tall, sun-darkened, and broad across the chest. His hat was in his hand, pressed against his thigh in a way that told her he had manners, not just muscle. His hair was dark and long enough to curl at his collar. A revolver rested on his hip, worn but clean. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said. "You did not," she said, though her voice cracked from the long day. "Do you need the bench?" He shook his head. "Name's Knox Fairburn. I board my horses here." "I saw you come off the coach earlier." Brielle looked down at her daughter. "Then you saw all there is to know." "I reckon not," he said. She studied him warily. Kind men had turned cruel on less, but his eyes, gray, steady, and not wandering, were focused on her face. "You got somewhere to stay?" "No," she said, "but I will manage. White Hollow ain't kind to folks sleeping in stables. We got wolves sometimes, real ones and the kind that wear boots." She stood slowly. "Thank you, but I am not looking for help." "Well, I am not offering charity," he said. "I got a ranch about 12 miles west. I could use someone to help with books, letters, things I am slow with. You could have the spare room, heat, food, safe bed for your girl." Brielle stared at him. "You do not know me." "I know what I see." "A woman holding a baby with her back straight after a long day. That tells me enough. You are offering work. I am offering something better than this bench." Brielle looked down at Etta. The baby's fingers curled in sleep. She had not cried once today. She had learned silence the hard way in the weeks since her father's death. Knox waited, his hat still in hand. "Why?" she asked finally. He met her eyes. "Because someone should." They rode out the next morning. His horse pulled a small cart and he gave her the reins without asking. She noticed that the land grew wide and quiet past the town. Fences stretched around fields still brown from winter. His ranch, called Twin Pines, for the trees that stood like sentries near the gate, was modest but strong. A 2-room cabin, smoke rising from the chimney, a barn with mended doors. Chickens scattered near the porch. She stepped down, legs sore, and he lifted Etta with careful hands. He held her like she was something precious, not a burden. "She is so small," he said softly. "She was born early. My husband died the night she came." Knox looked at her, not with pity but something gentler. "I am sorry." Brielle nodded. "So am I." Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and bread. He had made stew the night before, and it warmed her belly in a way that made her eyes sting unexpectedly. That night, after Etta was asleep in the cradle Knox had built years ago for a niece who never made it past her second winter, he sat with Brielle by the fire. "You were married," he said, not as a question. "Yes." "Was he good to you?" She nodded. "He was young, kind, but not built for hard things. When the barn caught fire, he ran back in for our dog." Knox's jaw tightened. Brave, foolish, she said, voice quiet, but I loved him. Knox looked into the fire. I never married. Came close once, but she wanted a man who made more. And you? I wanted someone who stayed. They sat in silence a long while. The next days passed with rhythm. Brielle swept the cabin, patched his shirts, read aloud his letters from cattle buyers. He taught her how to feed the chickens, how to check the fences. Etta gurgled louder every day. Knox made her laugh with silly faces. One morning, while Brielle hung laundry, she turned to see Knox holding Etta on his hip, the baby's tiny fingers gripping his shirt as he told her about the mule that refused to be shod. Brielle watched them, a knot forming in her throat. That evening, as the sun dipped low, she stood near the porch rail, arms folded. "Knox," she said. He joined her, quiet. "People told me no man would want me with a baby." He looked at her, then at Etta asleep in her arms. "They were wrong," he said. She blinked, heart-thudding. "I want you both," he said simply. Brielle's mouth parted, but no words came at first. "I do not need saving," she said. "I know," he said. "But I would still like to stay, if that is what you want." She looked down at Etta, then back at him. "I think I do." He reached out slow and brushed a lock of hair from her cheek. "Then we will build something here," he said. "Together." And for the first time in a long time, Brielle believed it. The snow melted in fits and starts across the fields, leaving the earth soft and smelling of damp pine and turned soil. It was the sort of spring that came late and slow, and Brielle found herself grateful for that. It gave her time to learn the patterns of the land without being rushed. Knox had started her on the ledgers that week, laying out account books on the kitchen table after supper. His handwriting was deliberate but uncertain, especially when it came to tallies and sums. Brielle's fingers moved faster, correcting figures with quiet confidence. He watched her, leaning his elbow on the table, his brow furrowed. "You always this quick with numbers?" "My father kept a feed store in Missouri. I ran the books before I could hem a sleeve." Knox nodded, pushing a worn pencil toward her. "Then you'll have this place running smoother than I ever did." A faint cry from the cradle pulled her attention, and she crossed the room without hesitation. Etta stirred in her sleep, fingers curling toward the ceiling. Brielle tucked the blanket back around her and kissed her forehead. When she turned, Knox was still watching. "You miss it?" he asked. She tilted her head. "Miss what?" "The life you left back there." "There's nothing to miss," she said. "The house burned before we buried him. My mother passed 2 winters before. I came west because there wasn't any east left." He nodded once, not pressing. He never did. That night she stepped out onto the porch for air. Knox was already there, sitting on the top step, boots planted wide, hands resting over his knees. The stars had come out thick and low, brushing the tops of the pines like ash on coal. She sat beside him without a word. The porch boards were cool beneath her. "You built this house yourself?" she asked. "Took me 2 years. I was 25, thought I knew everything. Spent the whole first winter patching mistakes. It's sturdy now. It ought to be. I made every error a man can make with a hammer." Brielle smiled faintly. "Still standing," he glanced at her. "Like you." There was quiet between them again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. "I used to think I'd never be still again," she said. "After he died, I kept moving, like if I stopped, the grief would catch up." "It always does," he said, "but not all at once. It shows up in pieces." She looked out over the dark field. "Sometimes I wonder what she'll remember, Etta. If she'll know what it cost me to carry on." "She'll remember you were there," Knox said, "that you kept her warm, that you sang when you thought she was asleep." Brielle's eyes flicked to him. "You heard that?" "I hear a lot from that barn window." The next day, Knox took her along for the branding. He had 6 hands working the outer range, all weathered men who nodded politely and didn't ask questions. She kept to the fence line, Etta bundled on her chest, while Knox rode the bay gelding through the dust, quiet and capable. At midday, he brought her a biscuit and a strip of cured meat wrapped in cloth. "You don't have to wait out here," he said. "I want to," she replied. "It's good to see where things come from." He leaned on the fence rail beside her, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. I didn't expect you'd take to this so easy. I didn't expect it either. You don't flinch much, he said. I already lived through the worst. Knox's gaze held hers a moment longer than it had to. Then maybe it's time for better. That evening she found a length of calico in an old trunk by the hearth. She sewed while Etta napped, her stitches even and sure. Knox came in carrying a sack of flour from the supply shed and paused when he saw the fabric spread across her lap. You making something? A dress, she said. Haven't had one that fit since before the baby, he moved closer. You'll look fine in it. She didn't look up. I don't know how to be courted like this. He crouched beside her, voice low. You don't have to know, I'm not in a hurry. The next morning she found a sprig of wild plum blossoms tucked into her place at the table. No note, no fuss. Just the scent of something new blooming, where something hard had once broken off. She didn't speak of it, but she kept the sprig in a glass jar beside the cradle. That night, as he finished the dishes and she folded the last of the laundry, he said, I've been thinking about the barn loft. She raised a brow. Could turn it into something better, a room for when Etta's older. Brielle folded a shirt, laid it on the pile. You planning that far ahead? He turned from the sink, drying his hands. I am now. She didn't reply right away, but her breath came a little deeper. Later, when he passed her the ledger to check over before bed, she rested her hand briefly over his. Just long enough to answer something unspoken. He didn't move, didn't startle, just let the moment settle between them. And when she pulled her hand away, she did it with the quiet certainty of someone choosing to stay. By mid-May, the pasture grass grew thick and green enough to brush against Brielle's skirts when she walked the southern fence. She carried Etta close, the baby dozing beneath the bonnet Brielle had stitched from an old flour sack. Each morning began with the clatter of the pump handle and the creak of the barn door, and ended with the hush of wind against the cabin walls long after the lamps were out. Knox had gone into town 3 days earlier, driving the wagon to collect lumber and salt blocks. He'd taken one of the hands, Tamaz, with him, promising to return before the week's end. The house had stayed quiet without him, not in a lonesome way, but in the manner of a book closed halfway through a chapter. Brielle spent the first day mending the hem of her second-best dress and boiling down the last of the wild rose hips into syrup. On the second, she moved Etta's cradle beside the eastern window where the morning light fell soft and golden. By the third day, with the sky thickening in the west, she began to worry. It wasn't storm weather, not yet, but the clouds had that low, drowsy look that sometimes turned mean. She kept glancing up from the porch, half listening for hooves. Just past dusk, the wagon finally rolled into view, its axles groaning under the weight of new beams and feed sacks. Knox stepped down before the wheels had fully stopped, brushing dust from his collar. His eyes found hers in the fading light. "You're late," she said, a little sharper than she meant to. There was a delay at the mill. Someone cut too much greenwood, they had to start over. She exhaled, nodding. "Supper's been waiting." He looked toward the house, then back at her. I'm fine." "Etta's fine." He hesitated before speaking again. "You worried," she didn't answer right away. "Your steady knocks when you weren't where you said," her voice caught. "It unsettled things." He took a slow step closer. "I'll be more careful about saying when." Inside, the cabin had held its warmth well. The stew pot had gone cold, but the cornbread was still fresh. Knox took his supper without speaking much, except to ask if Etta had taken to the new feeding schedule. She had. After the dishes, Brielle stood by the hearth, arms folded. Knox leaned against the doorframe. "Did you ever think about leaving Montana?" she asked. He tilted his head. "Once, after my brother passed, thought maybe I'd go to Dakota, try wheat. But this land has a way of holding on. I used to think I'd go back east when I had enough saved, but now I'm not sure what I'd be going to. You've got a place here." She shifted her weight. "I know, but a place isn't the same as belonging." Knox's voice softened. "You belong here, Brielle. Not just because you work hard or because I asked you to stay. It's because you've built something in this house I didn't know I was missing." She looked at him for a long moment. I've slept easier here than I have in months. That's not small. He crossed the room slowly, not reaching for her, just closing the space. I want to ask something, he said. Not because I think I've earned it, but because I want to build more than fences and ledgers with you. Brielle's breath stilled. Say it. I want to marry you, she blinked. I know it's sudden. You've been through enough change to fill a lifetime, but I've watched you care for this place, for her, for yourself. I've never been more certain. Brielle stepped back, not in retreat, but to clear the fog in her own thoughts. She turned toward the cradle. Etta's small chest rose and fell in sleep, one hand fisted beside her cheek. I never imagined another husband, not after burying one. I thought I'd raise her on my own, maybe teach again someday. But this. She turned back to him. This feels like something I didn't think I deserved anymore. Knox didn't speak. He let her words hang there, steady and real. She took a breath. Yes, his shoulders eased. You sure? I wouldn't say it if I wasn't, he nodded once. Then we'll go slow. The preacher comes through next month. That gives us time. I don't need time, she said. I just need to know you'll stay. I already promised that, he said. The day I saw you on that bench, outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Brielle walked to the door, opened it, and let the breeze wash through. When she turned, Knox was still watching her, not with hunger or desperation, but with the quiet awe of someone witnessing something begin. She reached for his hand, and he held it like something earned. Knox laid the last board along the loft wall just as the first cicadas began their summer song in the cottonwoods near the creek. The afternoon light slanted through the barn rafters, warm and gold, dust motes dancing in the still air. He leaned back on his heels, wiping his forehead with the edge of his sleeve, and glanced down through the open stall door. Brielle had come out with Etta bundled against her chest, a wide-brimmed straw hat shading both their faces. You said you wanted the rail set high, he called down. I did, she answered, tilting her chin upward. She'll be climbing before I'm ready. He stepped down the ladder carefully, joints stiff from the last 2 hours of hammering. When he reached the bottom, Brielle handed Etta over without a word. The baby blinked up at him, one hand clutching the fabric of his shirt in a sleepy grip. She's getting heavier, he said, bouncing her gently. She's eating better since I started grinding oats with the milk. Her cheeks are filling out. Knox looked at Brielle. Her face had changed over the last few weeks, not softened, exactly, but steadied, as though she'd settled into her own skin after a long time of wearing something too tight. I had a letter from my aunt in Kansas, she said, brushing hay from her skirt. She heard I was remarried. Someone must have told her through the church circle. He adjusted Etta in his arms. What'd she say? She wanted to know if I'd done it for a roof or for love. Knox didn't speak, waiting. I told her it was both, Brielle said. But mostly love. He reached for her hand, the one not holding the baby. You sure you're not just saying that for my benefit? She looked at him square. No, I've said things for other people before. This isn't one of them. They stayed there in the quiet barn, the smell of fresh pine and horse leather thick in the air. Etta let out a small sigh and drifted off again, her breath warm against Knox's collar. I've been thinking, Brielle said. I'd like to teach again. Not in a schoolhouse, but maybe here. Sundays, maybe Wednesdays too, if anyone's willing. Some of the ranch hands can't read. Tamaz told me he never learned. Knox nodded. You know you don't have to ask me. I'm not asking, she said. Just telling you first. He smiled, not with his mouth, but in the softening around his eyes. Then I'll build you a table long enough for 6. By early June, word had spread. The first Wednesday brought 2 of the younger hands, Tamaz and Illy, standing awkwardly by the porch with their hats in their hands. By the next week, a widow from the neighboring claim brought her niece and a boy with a limp. They sat on benches Knox had shaped from old fence rails, and Brielle wrote out lessons on scraps of paper, her voice low and even as they traced letters in charcoal and ash. Knox kept to the barn during the lessons, not wanting to crowd her space, but every now and then he'd catch her voice through the open window, calm and patient, the way she spoke to Etta when the baby fussed. That Sunday, after the students left, Brielle found Knox splitting kindling behind the storage shed. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "You've been quiet today." He didn't stop working. "Trying to stay out of your way." "Why?" He set the axe down and turned. "You have your own work now, and I don't want to crowd it." "You're part of it," she said. "You built the benches. I just cut wood. You listened. You made room. That counts." He wiped his hands on his trousers and stepped closer. "I like the sound of them learning. Makes the place feel more lived in." She touched his elbow. "You could join us if you wanted." He looked down. "I know enough to read the names on cattle tags and the numbers on a ledger. That's served me fine." "It's not about whether it's enough," she said. "It's about what you want." Knox was quiet for a long moment. "I want to be a man who keeps growing, for her. For you." She smiled then, a soft thing that reached all the way to the corners of her eyes. "Then you're already that man." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Knox sat on the porch with Etta in his lap. Her eyes were wide, watching the chickens scratch at the yard below. Brielle sat beside them, darning a sock, her needle slipping through the wool with practiced ease. "I've been thinking about a second corral," Knox said, rocking gently. "If this place keeps growing, we'll need space for more than just the bay and the mule." "Those lessons are going to bring in more than readers," she said. "Mrs. Green asked if I'd teach her how to keep account books. She's trying to run her husband's claim on her own. If she's anything like you, she'll manage." They sat quiet for a stretch, the kind of silence that asked nothing and gave everything. "You ever think," Brielle said, "about what your life would have been like if I hadn't stepped off that stagecoach?" He looked over, eyes steady. "I try not to." "Why?" "Because I'd rather live the one I have." She set her darning down and took his hand, her thumb brushing against the calluses along his palm. "You've given me more than shelter. You've given me a reason to build," he said. The sky darkened, stars blinking into view one by one. Etta stirred, curled tighter against his chest. Brielle rested her head on his shoulder, her breath easing in rhythm with his. And as the wind moved gentle through the cottonwoods, the house behind them full with the weight of quiet joy, they sat together, woman, man, and child, held not by need or chance, but by the simple, steady choosing of each other. The last week of June brought heat that settled deep in the soil and didn't let go. Brielle rose earlier each morning to sweep the cabin before the sun crept too high, her sleeves rolled and her hair pinned back in a loose coil. Etta, nearing 6 months, had begun to sit upright with help, her soft, downy hair sticking up like thistle fluff in the damp heat. Knox built a small bench that fit beside the porch rail so Brielle could set the baby in the shade while she shelled peas or peeled vegetables. One afternoon, as thunder rolled faintly over the far hills, Knox returned from the west slope with a bundle of broken wire and a split boot heel. He set both beside the cabin door and leaned against the frame. Found a stray calf tangled up near the edge of the ravine. "Took me half the day to pull her out and another half to get her walking straight." Brielle reached for the kettle, splashing cool water into a basin. "She going to make it? She's skittish. Might not hold weight on that leg for a while, but she's eating." He pulled off his worn boots and sat just inside the doorway, watching her hands as she worked. The scent of lemon balm drifted from the sprig she'd tucked behind her ear that morning, and Knox found himself staring longer than he meant to. "You always this calm when things go sideways?" he asked. "I used to panic more," she said, "but I've learned there's no point in rushing through trouble. It finds its own pace." Knox leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "What do you want this place to be, Brielle? Not just the land, but the life." She looked up from the basin, water clinging to her fingers. "I want it to carry weight, not just chores and days passing. I want to know that what we make here means something." Knox nodded, quiet for a time. "I've been thinking about building a root cellar and fencing off a kitchen garden near the north side. There's space. Enough for beans, squash, maybe some corn if we're lucky with the rain." Brielle dried her hands on a cloth and stepped over, crouching beside him. "Then let's do it. One row at a time." The garden took shape slowly. Knox dug fence posts while Brielle marked the rows with twine. She taught Etta to press seeds into the dirt with her small thumb, laughing as the baby smeared soil across her cheeks. They worked in the evenings when the heat broke, pausing only when the chickens wandered too close or the wind tossed grit into their faces. One day, Knox came home from town with a parcel wrapped in oilcloth. He laid it on the table and nodded for her to open it. Inside was a hand-bound ledger with a green cloth cover and thick pages. "I thought you might want to keep a record," he said, "not just for accounts." "For yourself." Her fingers traced the edge of the cover. "You remembered I used to write. I don't forget the things that matter." She opened the book to the first page and ran her hand down the blank paper, then looked up at him. "Will you read it when I'm gone someday?" "I'd rather read it while you're here." They married under the cottonwood near the creek, just past midsummer. The preacher's voice was low and steady, and the neighbors stood in a loose half-circle, their hats held respectfully in their hands. Etta reached for Knox's collar as he lifted her during the blessing, her eyes wide and curious. Brielle wore a dress she'd sewn from muslin dyed with walnut husks. It wasn't grand, but it fit her well, and Knox hadn't stopped looking at her since she stepped out of the cabin that morning. After the vows, they walked the length of the pasture together, the guests trailing behind, laughter rising like birds from tall grass. Brielle's hand never left his. That night, after the guests had gone and the sky turned lavender with dusk, Knox carried Etta to her cradle while Brielle washed the last of the cups in the basin. When he returned, he stood beside her at the sink, hands on her waist. "I never thought I'd have this," he said. She turned, resting her forehead against his. "You built it." They stood that way for a long time, the quiet around them full of promise. The seasons turned, each one layering over the last like rings in old wood. The garden grew strong. The school lessons continued, now held in a small outbuilding Knox had finished before the first frost. The ranch hands brought their children, and Brielle taught them to read by lantern light, her voice low and patient. Knox added a lean-to for firewood and a pen for goats. He kept a worn cloth in his back pocket to wipe Etta's hands when she toddled after him, her little boots leaving crooked prints in the mud by the following spring. Etta could say both their names, clear and steady. She followed Brielle into the garden, pointing to each plant with pride. Knox built a swing from rope and pine, hanging it from the old cottonwood. On warm evenings, Brielle pushed Etta back and forth, her laughter rising with the wind. Knox sat nearby, carving a new spoon for the kitchen, his eyes never far from them. Their days filled with small things: shared bread, fence repairs, letters written and answered. Nights were quieter still, wrapped in the hush of firelight and the low hum of crickets. They spoke less as time went on, not out of silence but understanding. They'd said the hard things already. What remained was the living. One evening, as summer folded into the first golden weeks of September, Brielle stood by the porch rail while Knox brought in the wash. Etta napped on a quilt nearby, her fingers curled around a wooden horse he'd carved for her birthday. Brielle looked out across the pasture. "Do you ever think we'll leave here?" she asked softly. He set the basket down and stepped beside her. "No, not unless the land goes dry or the sky falls." She reached for his hand. "Good. I don't want to leave anything we've made." "You won't have to," he said. "Not now, not ever." And she believed him, because the house stood firm and the fences held, because the garden grew and the child thrived, because love, when built slow and tended well, does not wither, not here. Not between them, they stayed and they grew old together. The porch boards wore smooth beneath their feet, the books on the shelf filled with stories. The land held them and they held each other. Always.